I'm Tom Brokaw. The NBC White Papers were started by NBC News in the 1960s, and this highly acclaimed series of documentary reports quickly became an industry standard, covering some of the most important and fascinating issues of our time. One of their first topics was the Cold War. For 45 years, from the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union, world events were shaped by the superpower struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. A crucial chapter in the story of that struggle is the death of one of the fathers of the Cold War, Joseph Stalin. Coming at the end of a nearly 30-year reign of terror, his death would have a major impact on the United States. The NBC News White Paper you're about to see was first broadcast on January 27, 1963, 3 months after the biggest showdown of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Cuba, October 1962. For 1 week, the world hangs on the brink of nuclear annihilation.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Nikita Khrushchev holds the fate of civilization in his hands. This time, he does not push the button. A crisis passes. But the underlying problem remains. Why does Nikita Khrushchev act as he does? He is told as part of the answer. He says he is a Marxist. The other part is hidden behind the Kremlin walls. This report and the one that follows concern that hidden part. To get at it, we have to go back 10 years. To this man, Joseph Stalin, then at the height of his power. To the events of a fateful 12 months in the history of the Soviet Union.
Think back a decade. Most of us had a simple view of the Soviet Union then. Its tactics were crude and inflexible. We knew about the bloody purges of the 30s. We had lived through the Berlin blockade. Americans were dying in Korea. The Cold War was a hard, simple fact. Well, it's no longer simple. With this, the first of two reports, we begin to examine how and why that changed. Many of the facts are still shrouded in mystery. But this is an attempt to pierce that mystery, to find out what really happened. To do this has involved many months of investigation in many countries, eyewitness testimony from journalists, diplomats, former communist officials, communist leaders. We begin to piece together the story in Moscow. The year is 1952. The communist revolution in Russia is 35 years old. Its living god is Joseph Stalin. His face is everywhere. For a quarter of a century, he has ruled the lives of the Russian people. His whim has meant life or death for them. He is called by Nikita Khrushchev our hope, our expectation, the beacon that guides all progressive mankind. He is 72 years old. His health seems excellent. His power is absolute. Before him pass thousands of his soldiers. The atmosphere in Moscow is grim, hostile. He has expelled the American ambassador. He says war with the imperialists is inevitable. Beside him, on top of the mausoleum of Lenin, stand his heirs. Malenkov, he seems closest to Stalin. Beria, chief of the secret police. Molotov, Stalin's old comrade in arms. Stalin trusts none of them.
It is the morning of October 5th, 1952. Moscow is being scrubbed, washed down. A great event is about to take place. The first Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 13 years. The elite of the communist world are in Moscow. Stalin has already laid down the new party line. Stricter control in internal matters. A tougher foreign policy. The delegates come to the great hall of the Kremlin to hear the details. No non-communist is permitted inside the Kremlin walls. The events which follow are masked by secrecy. This man was an eyewitness. His name is Auguste Lecour. In 1952, he was the number 2 man in the French Communist Party. He led the French delegation to the Congress.
When a foreign communist leader goes to Moscow to attend a Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, I believe one can detect in him the same feeling a Muslim must have when he goes to Mecca, or a Catholic when he makes a pilgrimage to the Vatican to receive the Pope's blessing. The 19th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union opened on October 5th at about 7 p.m. And naturally, like all the other delegates, my eyes were fixed on the platform. It wasn't long before the leaders appeared and there was respectful applause. Contrary to what we expected, Stalin was not the first, but next to last. When Stalin appeared, the applause doubled. It became true delirium. I have often witnessed similar scenes, but never anything like that. Then the meeting began. It is difficult to talk about all the speeches because there were 10 sessions with more than 130 speakers. Therefore, I will keep to the essentials. Molotov made the opening speech. It was not an important speech. What was significant was that after Stalin, Molotov received the greatest ovation. After this, the serious business began with the speech of Georgii Malenkov, secretary of the Central Committee of the party. This report lasted 5 hours by the clock. Every word was permeated with Stalin's thoughts. Like all the speeches that followed, it showed that this Congress was a true Stalin festival. I must mention the speech made by Nikita Khrushchev. Like all the other speakers, Khrushchev elaborated on his admiration for Stalin. He said it was thanks to Stalin's leadership that they were so successful. Finally, the one we were all waiting for arose. Stalin stood on the platform, and once again, shouts and applause greeted him. One can say, in summing up the works of this Congress, that it showed Stalin's indisputable authority, his absolute power. Later, on an occasion at the Bolshoi Theater, one thing was clear. Never had a Congress appeared so united. The political heirs of Stalin are not concerned with the fact that the situation from which they profit today was carefully prepared by Stalin. They don't blame Stalin for the omelet he left them, but hypocritically they now attack him for breaking the eggs. This, of course, permits them to eat Stalin's omelet with the best appetite in the world. I have never heard such enthusiasm as they showed then. But with all that followed, I must say I am no longer certain that they were all sincere.
Long live the great Soviet Union, the indestructible bulwark of peace, democracy, and socialism. Long live the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the party of Lenin, Stalin. Long years of good health to our dear teacher and leader, the great Stalin.
The show ends. Life gets back to normal. Behind the facade is an ugly reality. The Soviet Union has not recovered from the war. The economy is at a standstill. Stalin's leadership has failed. Behind the scenes, there is grumbling. Severin Bialer, then a member of the Central Committee of the Polish Communist Party, is a witness.
There was a disagreement with a rosy picture which was painted by Malenkov at the 90 Party Congress about the state of the Soviet economy, and especially about the state of agriculture. There were many even highly placed party members who asked, how is it possible that the grain problem in the Soviet Union is solved, as Malenkov said at the Congress, and at the same time there is not enough food, there is not enough bread even. There was a general feeling in the party circles, and there were many indications which pointed in this direction, that the great purge, may be comparable to the purge of the 30s, was being prepared.
You suddenly got the feeling that something was moving, something was happening in Moscow, like dark currents under an ice field. Where it was going, we didn't know, but something was happening. After that, there were 2 or 3 more weeks of quiet, and then one evening I was in my office in the Metropole Hotel. The provincial papers had just come in, and I was opening them up, and I picked up the Kiev paper from Ukraine. Down in the corner at page 1, I saw a little announcement, the like of which I'd never seen in the years I'd been in Moscow. It was the announcement of the execution of 2 or 3 men down in Kiev by a military collegium. They'd been shot on charges of what amounted to nothing more than commercial bribery or corruption. About 10 days later, I picked up another small, obscure publication, something called the Agitator's Handbook, a little throwaway that they gave to the ward heelers, the local party workers, to give them the party line. And in that publication, I found a piece of open anti-Semitic propaganda, the first propaganda of that nature I'd seen in Moscow, too. Was there a pattern there? Possibly there was.
Within days, the pattern is clear. The purge strikes in a dozen cities. It touches every group. Fear is everywhere.
There are wild rumors, one wilder than another, to the effect that doctors, nurses, hospital people were plotting against the regime. Many prominent doctors were arrested. Some of the drugstores were even closed. The grapevine, old women in the market gossiped to the effect that part of the plot had been to poison the drug supplies, so that some Russian people were afraid to buy ordinary drugs, cotton wool, aspirin tablets. Something was building up. It was almost like in the Middle Ages.
In that atmosphere of growing tension, correspondents in Moscow got invitations one night to go to the Bolshoi Theater. It was a typical event. The Polish delegation in town, they're going to have a program in their honor. We went to the theater. It was its usual glittering self. The only thing that was unusual was that the leadership box was occupied. The leadership box was the front forward box on the left-hand side, half curtained so that the hoi polloi, meaning the correspondents and the ordinary people in Moscow, were invited to this, couldn't quite see who was there, unless the Stalin and the others happened to lean around to deliberately let themselves be shown. We saw them that night. They did lean around so that they were shown. There were half a dozen of them there. They talked and chatted. We went home after the theater, didn't file any stories on it. It wasn't worth it. It was just a social evening in Moscow. Well, I went to my office in the Metropole Hotel on the morning of January 13th and picked up Pravda. I looked at page 1. There was no news on page 1, and I turned to look at the back page. My eye immediately caught a small item under an inconspicuous headline, and as I started to read it, my blood chilled. It was the most sinister, the most dangerous item that I had seen since I had been in Moscow. It was the announcement of the doctors' plot, the so-called plot of the Kremlin doctors, in which a group of physicians, a number of them Jewish, were charged with deliberately plotting and conspiring against the lives of leading members of the Soviet hierarchy.
No one outside the Kremlin knows yet why this is happening. But this much is clear. The purges are being carried out by Stalin, or with his consent. The targets seem to be his lieutenants. Which of them is next? Only Stalin knows. And the only non-communist who sees him is Indian Ambassador K.P.S. Menon on February 17, 1953.
Stalin said he was glad to see me. He said, I conceive it to be my duty as Prime Minister to receive the heads of diplomatic missions. I thought to myself that he hadn't been very zealous in the discharge of his duty because the number of ambassadors he had received after the end of the Second World War could be counted on the fingers of one hand. And then he went on to say something memorable. He said, Mr. Ambassador, our peasant is a simple man, but wise. When he sees a wolf, he shoots it. He doesn't preach morals to the wolf, he shoots it. And the wolf knows it and behaves accordingly. And I then looked over at the paper on which he had been doodling, and I saw a number of wolves in different poses. One wolf standing on its hind legs, and now two more wolves confronting each other. The whole paper seemed to be full of wolves.
This is the last time the outside world sees Stalin. 7 days later, on February 25th, all talk of purges suddenly stops. No one on the outside knows why. One man who may know the answer is Philippe Bem. He was Warsaw correspondent for the French newspaper Le Monde and the Israeli newspaper Maarif. He is a famous and respected journalist.
One evening, early in 1957, the phone rang in my Warsaw hotel. A Polish journalist wanted to see me immediately. Few moments later, he told me a fantastic story about Stalin. This story, he said, was just told to prominent Polish journalists by the Soviet ambassador to Warsaw, Panteleimon Ponomarenko, who once was a member of the Soviet Communist Party Presidium. I was tempted to phone it immediately to my papers abroad, but I had some doubt. Is his version accurate? Perhaps the Pole didn't understand the Russian language very well. Next morning, with a friendly American journalist, we took a cab and rode to the Soviet embassy. We gave our card at the reception desk, and I couldn't believe my eyes when few moments later we were introduced to the study of the Soviet ambassador. And he began to tell me his story. We were about 2 dozen sitting around the big table in the Kremlin room. The discussion was lively. Suddenly, Stalin dropped on the floor. We all rushed to him, but he couldn't be moved. He was lying motionless, his eyes closed, obviously dead. Suddenly, Beria jumped in the middle of the hall, began to shout in a jubilant mood, "Comrades, what a marvelous moment! Comrades, at least the tyrant is dead. What a marvelous day. We are free. We can breathe freely. We're not afraid to be shot next day." We still stood motionless and were staring at Beria, then at the motionless body of Stalin. Suddenly, we saw that Stalin opened one eye, then a second one, and although he didn't speak a word, he was looking again perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. Beria didn't notice this at first, but when he realized that Stalin is looking at us, he ran to the body, fell on his knees, raised his hands, and began to plead, "Dear Joseph Vissarionovich, forgive me. Dear Joseph Vissarionovich, you know how faithful I was to you in the past. Believe me, I will be faithful again. Forgive me." Stalin didn't say a word, and slowly his one eye closed, then the other closed, and this was the story about Stalin's stroke, as told to me by Panteleimon Ponomarenko, once a member of the Soviet Communist Party Presidium.
Michel Gordet reported from Moscow for Francois. He too heard the story.
3 years later, in April 1960, a French high official told me that exactly the same story had been told to him by Nikita Khrushchev, who was then in France on a state visit on the invitation of General de Gaulle.
Khrushchev's story of the struggle for power, as I heard and reported it, began with Stalin lying on his deathbed in the Kremlin. These are the details. Beria was out of town. The other members of the Politburo, for the first time, were admitted to Stalin's room. They found to their astonishment that there were no doctors in attendance. They asked why, and they were given 3 reasons. First, that Stalin had had seizures before and had recovered. Second, that he was suspicious of doctors. And third, that it was difficult to get doctors to come and attend him because on other occasions, doctors had come and had never returned home afterward. They did get one of the top doctors of Moscow. He came, looked through the door, refused, however, to enter the room alone until he had colleagues. So they sent for 2 more, and when the other 2 arrived, the 3 of them went into the room and examined Stalin and reported to the members of the Presidium that if they had been called 2 days earlier, there might have been something they could do, but then it was too late.
Sitting in my booth at the Central Telegraph, when a Russian acquaintance of mine walked in, signaled me to follow him. I followed him down to the street, and he told me the report, which he said he had from very good sources, to the effect that Stalin had suffered a stroke. I'd had fairly reliable information from this person before, and I had no reason to doubt. But I had no illusions as to the ability of passing anything through the censorship, unless it had been officially announced. At any rate, I prepared a flash, reporting unofficially, without confirmation, that Stalin had suffered a stroke and may be dying. The message was written in English. I handed it in to a girl receptionist whose duty it was to accept such messages and then pass them on to a censor behind a green curtain. The girl apparently knew enough English to read my message, and as she finished reading it, she turned color, rolled it all up into one ball, and threw it in my face and refused to accept it.
Pravda, March 4th, 1953. The sickness of Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. The medical bulletin in Pravda is signed by 10 doctors. Stalin has suffered a brain hemorrhage. His right arm and leg are paralyzed. He cannot speak. Direction of the government has been taken over by Stalin's closest comrades in arms, Malenkov, Molotov, Beria. A long line forms outside Lenin's tomb. The people are told to display unity, solidarity, and vigilance. The chief rabbi of Moscow calls for a day of fasting. Prayers are said at the Central Synagogue. At the Yelakovsky Cathedral, the Patriarch calls on God to spare Stalin's life.
The bulletins that day of March 5th, it indicated very clearly that Stalin was sinking rapidly. From time to time that evening, I left the office to circulate around the city to try and pick up some clue as to what was going on. It was typical March weather for Moscow. Cold, raw, blustery. I made a complete circuit of the Kremlin. Lights were blazing in the Kremlin. I hoped I might get some clue as to what was happening inside. An hour or so later, I made another circuit of the city. By this time, there was hardly any traffic on the streets. People had gone to bed. They went to bed early in Moscow in those days. There were fewer lights on the Kremlin by that time. No cars going in and out. Thought came to me that perhaps the Soviet leadership, the Presidium, had been meeting that evening. And the meeting was over and the members had now gone home.
On March 5th, I was listening to the evening broadcast of the Soviet press agency TASS over Radio Moscow. It was a regular news broadcast beamed to the regional press at dictation speed. Shortly after 11 o'clock Paris time, the broadcast was interrupted in an unusual manner. The speaker said in an excited voice, "Stand by! We are interrupting our broadcast for 20 minutes. Stand by, stand by." And so I did. And the long waiting began. Every 20 minutes, the announcer repeated, "Stand by," without giving additional news. I waited each time tensely for the dramatic news we were expecting, almost 48 hours. Finally, at around 2 a.m. in the morning, the announcer spoke quietly and slowly. "Внимание, внимание, говорит Москва. Pay attention, Moscow speaking. Слушайте нашу передачу для республиканских и районных газет. Listen to our broadcast for provincial press. Информация номер 18. Information number 18. Точка, full stop. Brackets, TASS, full stop. Paragraph." And then began the reading of the lengthy communique. Дорогие товарищи и друзья, dear comrades and friends, Центральный комитет Коммунистической партии Советского Союза, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and so on. It took some 6 or 7 minutes to come to the point. Скончался Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin is dead.
It is 6 a.m., the morning of March 6, 1953. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin has been dead for 8 hours and 10 minutes. The news has been public for 2 hours. Pravda, the immortal name of Stalin, will live forever in the hearts of the people of the Soviet Union and of all progressive mankind. Attention! Moscow speaking. Comrade citizens, a plea from the Central Committee of the Party and the Council of Ministers. Our task is to guard against any kind of disorder and panic. Why are the leaders afraid of panic? Why did they wait 6 hours to announce Stalin's death? What is happening behind the Kremlin walls? Who now holds the power Stalin held? No one on the outside yet knows.
I walked over into Red Square to see what was happening there. The sun was shining brightly. It was warmer than it had been the night before. And out there in the middle of the square, I saw something that I'd never seen in all my life in Moscow. A crowd of people standing right out in the middle of the square. 150, perhaps 200 people. I couldn't figure out what they were waiting for. They were standing silently, looking toward the Kremlin, saying nothing to each other, their faces impassive. I still don't know what they expected, but they expected something.
While Moscow waits, the news is sent out around the world. East Germany, Stalin is dead. The UN, Soviet delegate Andrei Vyshinsky.
The heart that is no longer beating is that of the great leader of the Soviet people, of our great teacher, and is a great herald and banner bearer of peace throughout the world, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin.
Stalin is dead, and he cannot bequeath to anyone his prestige. A new era begins, an era in which the guiding spirit is liberty, not enslavement, and when human relations will be those of fraternity, not one-man domination.
Well, I just say it was good riddance. Now all I hope is that we don't have another one to worry about that could be worse.
All across the communist world, the mourning for Stalin begins. This is Budapest, the Hungarian parliament. The chief mourner is Imre Nagy. 3 years from now, the Russians will kill him. This is East Berlin. On this March day, the East Berliners are mourning Stalin. 3 months from now, they will be killing communists in the streets. It will take Soviet tanks to subdue them. Their revolt will be the pretext for the liquidation of one of the new Soviet rulers.
Durch die Allee, die Stalins Namen trägt, zog der Trauermarsch der werktätigen Berlins. Hunderttausende kamen, legten Blumen nieder, und in ihrem Blick stand neben der Trauer das Gelöbnis, dass sie sich noch fester mit der Lehre wappnen werden, die ihnen Stalin als Vermächtnis hinterlassen hat.
It is mid-afternoon now in Moscow. Stalin lies in the Hall of Columns. Lines have been forming in the street outside for hours. In the next 100 hours, 5 million people will stream past the body of Stalin. 3 lines go back miles through the squares of Moscow. The lines move slowly. The people have to wait in the bitter cold for hours.
There were some strange things that happened during those waits. It was cold, wintertime. Some of the young people would set a bonfire going, keep themselves warm while they waited. Somebody would have a bayon, a Russian accordion. He'd start playing it. First thing you knew, there'd be a bunch of youngsters dancing. Strange atmosphere for a funeral. Over in a corner, you'd see a couple of old fellows with a bottle of vodka taking a snort or two. Right next to them, there would be an old woman all in black with tears streaming down her face.
Inside, a symphony orchestra plays funeral music around the clock. The crystal chandeliers are wreathed with crepe. Flowers are banked to the ceiling. Hour after hour, the mourners file silently by. They see Stalin on his bier. He wears the special uniform of a generalissimo. His heirs form an honor guard at his side. Each now shares part of the power he held. Malenkov, his strength is in the party and the bureaucracy. Molotov, supported by the old guard Bolsheviks. Beria, he controls the secret police. They stand frozen, silent, beside Stalin's corpse. They watch each other. Who will make the first move? For 100 hours, Stalin remains on view. The mourners get one last look, then the line pushes on.
One quick glance at the body, and then you were past. As you came out, all of a sudden you found yourself outside, in sort of a field kitchen set up to feed the troops, and the smell of borscht filling the atmosphere, and you were outdoors. And that was Stalin's mourning.
March 9th, 10:20 a.m., the funeral of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Massed cannons fire a final salute. 30 guns, 10 salvos to the minute. For the next 3 minutes, nothing moves in the Soviet Empire, from Vladivostok to East Berlin. In Red Square, the ceremony begins. The new leaders go to the mausoleum of Lenin, to speak their funeral orations. Malenkov says Stalin's name will live forever. His listeners have no way of knowing the new rulers have already begun to plot to destroy Stalin's name, to destroy each other. Stalin's remains are placed in the mausoleum of Lenin by his heirs. As they file solemnly out, each knows the struggle for Stalin's power has begun. The power is divided now. They know it won't remain divided. One of them will finally have it all. Night comes to Moscow. No one knows what is going to happen next, only that nothing will ever be quite the same again.
As I walked down toward the Hall of Columns, I saw a bunch of workmen. They were tidying things up after the funeral. They were taking down the great portrait of Stalin, a two-story portrait of Stalin that had been on the outside of the Hall of Columns. And as they lowered it down, it fell on one end with a crash. One of the workmen said to the others, "Осторожней, be careful." One of his companions said, "Oh, that's all right. We won't be needing this one again."
In March 1953, Stalin is dead. The power structure he created remains. The struggle for control of it has begun. At first, it seems to fall into the hands of his heir apparent, Georgii Malenkov. But within a week, Malenkov loses his job as party secretary. He is replaced by a party functionary almost unknown in the West, one N.S. Khrushchev. A precarious balance of power continues among three of the men who carried Stalin to his tomb. Malenkov, he was the closest to Stalin at the end. Molotov, he is the last of the old revolutionary leaders. Beria, his secret police are Stalin's old weapon of terror and power. The balance cannot last. It does not. In the first hours after Stalin's death, Beria makes his bid. He holds a strong hand. He commands a private army, 2 million men with tanks and planes. He is the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. He is also the most hated, the most feared. He can seize power. He probably cannot hold it. For that, he needs support he does not now have. His record as the man who carried out Stalin's bloody purges has left him without allies. He makes a move to change that.
Long live our mighty homeland, indomitable bulwark of liberty and peace. Long live the party of Lenin and Stalin.
The Presidium held a meeting to decide future policy. They went down the line, each man giving his opinion, and most agreed as they went along that the Stalin reign of terror would have to end. Beria was the last on the list to speak. He described the general situation in the Soviet Union as he saw it from the point of view of the police chief. He claimed that the country was full of enemies, traitors, and spies, and that a purge was necessary. But he agreed that the people were so nervous and distressed and disturbed that he proposed a 6-month period of relaxation first on both the home and foreign fronts.
He tried to endear himself to various groups in the Soviet society and to various groups in the party so that they will support his bid for power. The first indication of his liberal tactics came at Stalin's funeral, when in his speech was one of the three speakers, Stalin's funeral, he said that the Soviet people can sleep peacefully, that they don't have to worry any moves from the Soviet police that will be similar to that of the Stalin era. And this was really the beginning of his attempt to create a different image of Beria that existed before, a more liberal image.
The Russian people feel the effect of this move. More food appears in the shops. There are more things to buy. Prices are reduced. No one outside the Kremlin knows the reason yet. They only know the atmosphere has changed. fear of a purge no longer hangs over them. People have come home from the prison camps. The terrible tensions they have lived under for so many years are suddenly relaxed. In April, Beria makes his next move. He goes on an inspection tour. Everywhere he goes, supporters of Malenkov and Molotov are purged. Key jobs go to supporters of Beria in Georgia, in the Ukraine, in the Baltic provinces. Back in the Kremlin, the power and intentions of Lavrentiy Beria are clearly visible.
Beria commanded the 24 NKV divisions in the Soviet Union, of which 4 were always on duty in Moscow as the garrison. He commanded the guard of the Kremlin. He alone of all the members of the Presidium were allowed to carry arms into the Kremlin. He commanded and controlled and named the drivers and the servants of the others. He tapped their telephone lines. The result was that for them to even talk together, they had to try to meet on street corners by apparent accident and whisper words to each other. In spite of the difficulties, they did manage to communicate to each other a general agreement. They all agreed that Beria had to go.
The facts, the meat of the whole case, was presented in a secret letter signed by the Soviet leadership, which was directed to the party officials in Soviet Russia. This letter was also sent to the leadership of the Polish party. As a staff member of the Polish Central Committee, I had access to this letter. Also in the letter was contained a description of the tactics that they use for fighting Beria. They said that they had to be very cautious. Although they knew about Beria's activities, they knew that he is trying to eliminate other members of the Presidium and to achieve a dictatorial power for himself. They were trying to convince him that they don't know about it. They were sitting with him together on the meetings of the Presidium, not accusing him of anything. They were concentrating their own powers, waiting for the proper moment.
As his enemies wait, fateful events begin in East Germany. Beria is responsible for the internal security of the Soviet Empire. On the surface, the East German regime looks strong and stable. Behind this facade, its economy is collapsing. Resistance is growing. As part of Beria's plan to relieve tension, to make his image more liberal, Soviet troops are pulled out. June 16th, East Berlin is in revolt. What begins as a protest against increased norms becomes a revolution against the communists. Beria's enemies in the Kremlin have been given the pretext they're looking for. June 17th, Soviet tanks arrive. In 2 days, they will put down the revolt. But Soviet prestige has suffered a damaging blow, and the hold of the Soviet Union on its satellites has been seriously weakened. Someone has miscalculated. Responsibility must be fixed for what is happening here. In the Kremlin, it is decided the man who is responsible is Lavrentiy Beria. On June 26th, there is a performance of Swan Lake at the Bolshoi Theater. All of the leaders are present, except one. It seems to be a normal summer evening in Moscow. In In the early hours of the morning of June 27th, Pravda's presses begin to roll.
The paper was out at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I sat down to look at it. There didn't seem to be anything very important. I looked down in the corner of page 1. There was one little note that struck my eye. The leaders of the Communist Party had been to the Bolshoi Theater that night, and it mentioned who was there. I ran through the list of the leadership. Everyone had been there but one man, Beria. I thought about that. This was a period of time when collective leadership was being emphasized. They all went together, attended the same parties. It seemed to me this was significant. I filed a story to the Times, not a social item, but a political item. It got through late on a Sunday morning. As it turned out, with a big Sunday paper, the Times didn't get it in print.
How did they get Beria? The facts are hidden behind the Kremlin walls. What follows is the jigsaw puzzle as we have pieced it together. This is Eugenio Reale. He was once a member of the Italian Communist Party. He tells this story as it was told to him by a fellow communist who has since died.
According to what my colleague Celeste Negarville reported to me when he returned from Moscow, Khrushchev spoke in the following manner about Beria's death to the delegation of the Italian Communist Party. Khrushchev said to them, "We knew right after Stalin's death that Beria was preparing a coup d'etat. For 2 weeks, we didn't sleep in our homes because we were afraid of being arrested. We felt secure only in our offices in the Kremlin, protected by our personal guards. We decided to get rid of Beria. So we made a series of phone calls, pretending we wanted to offer full power to Beria, and knowing all the time that our calls were being overheard by Beria's secret police. Then we sent Voroshilov to Beria to propose a meeting at which we would make Beria first secretary of the party and chairman of the Council of Ministers." This is the story Negarville told me that Khrushchev had told him and the others in the delegation.
Reale's story is denied by the two communists who were present with Negarville. Giancarlo Paietta, number 2 man in the Italian Communist Party, calls it sheer fantasy.
A proposito della narrazione della fine di Beria è pura fantasia.
Senator Giacomo Pellegrini calls it a fantastic tale.
Altrettanta fermezza che tutto ciò è parto di fantasiosi racconti.
Georges Brutel is Assistant Secretary General of the French Socialist Party. He and French Senator Pierre Comin heard a version of Beria's fall from Khrushchev himself.
Pierre Comin se trouvait assis juste en face.
Pierre Comin was sitting just across from Khrushchev. Khrushchev began to tell us about Beria's plot to take power, about how the other leaders had found out about this plot and how they had put Beria on the defensive. Khrushchev said to Pierre Comin, conscious of the effect of his words, "You see, Beria was sitting in the very chair in which you are sitting at this moment. Beria was sitting in this chair while we accused him and pointed out his faults and responsibilities. It was while he was sitting there, where you are sitting, that we unmasked him." Khrushchev then added that Beria was allowed to go out of the room. He was arrested in the antechamber and taken to the Lubyanka prison.
The most plausible account I heard of how it was actually done came from Khrushchev's own lips, a story which he himself told to a group of foreign communist delegates to the 22nd Communist Party Congress in Moscow and the Kremlin last October.
The story heard by Shapiro varies only in minor details from the one that came to NBC's Joseph C. Harsh.
Whether the story is history, of course, we can't possibly know. It was given to me from a source which I am sure gave me an accurate account of what Khrushchev had said. They had succeeded in getting out of Moscow the 4 NKVD divisions which were always under Beria's command and in control of the city of Moscow. And they had arranged the meeting where the room where the presidium met, with a bell under the edge of the table in front of Malenkov, who at that time was chairman, running into the next room where 4 army generals were placed. Beria was in the room, apparently not at all suspicious, until Khrushchev asked a question which tipped him off, at which point Beria reached for his gun, which he kept in his briefcase, he being the only member of the Central Committee who was allowed to come armed into the Kremlin. Khrushchev says that he'd already removed the gun from Beria's briefcase. Beria discovered the empty briefcase, went white, and started to do something, whatever one does when you realize what's up. At which point Malenkov reached for the button, but his hand trembled, and according to Khrushchev, Malenkov was incapable of pushing it, so Khrushchev reached over, pushed the button. The 4 generals came into the room, and in the version I heard, as Khrushchev tells the story, the Beria problem was solved then and there, and subsequently they smuggled Beria's body out of the Kremlin through the NKVD guards. There still remained the 24 NKVD divisions all over Russia. Khrushchev said that this problem also was liquidated, but not without bloodshed.
How did Beria die? Officially, he is tried December 16, 1953, executed December 24th. Only the men in the Kremlin know beyond doubt when and how Beria died. We can only be certain that he did die. That with his death, the domination of the secret police in the Soviet power struggle is broken. That the breaking of this domination marks the real death of Stalin, who for a quarter of a century ruled Russia with this weapon of terror. It takes 8 years more for his heirs finally to bury him. In October 1961, at the 22nd Party Congress, an old woman named D.A. Lazurkina, member of the party since 1902, speaks. She says, "I demand that Stalin be removed from the tomb of Lenin." She says, "Lenin is in my heart. Yesterday I asked him for advice, and it was as if he stood before me alive and said, 'I do not like being next to Stalin, who inflicted so much harm on the party.'" The tomb is closed. The body of Stalin is removed. It is buried under a plain stone near the Kremlin wall. The embalmed body will be allowed to rot. Stalin is dead. With the liquidation of Lavrentiy Beria in 1953, a new chapter in Soviet history begins. Ahead lies the Hungarian revolt. Rocket diplomacy, men in space, the emergence of the Soviet Union as a superpower, the Berlin Wall, Cuba, and Nikita Khrushchev. 2 factors make his rise possible: the death of Stalin and the end of Stalin's crude rule of terror. New power factors emerge. A new kind of Soviet man, more subtle, more dangerous, harder to understand and cope with. Our second report at this same time next Sunday will examine the rise of Nikita Khrushchev.
Будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем, что больше не будешь ухать.